Good morning. My name is Michelle Armstrong, and I have the pleasure of being your liturgist this morning. I'm reading from both the Old Testament and New Testament this morning. First from Proverbs 13, 10 and 12, and then Hebrews 2, 13 through 20. I'm reversing those. I'm doing Proverbs first. Sorry. By pride comes nothing but strife, but with the well-advised is wisdom. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but when the desire comes, it is the tree of life. And then Hebrews 2, 13 through 20. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, here am I and the children whom God has given me. Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of the flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. For indeed he does not give aid to angels, but he does give aid to the seed of Abraham. Therefore, in all things he had to be made like his brethren, that he might be merciful and a faithful high priest in the things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to aid those who are tempted. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Wow, I feel like a rock star. I got the makings of a backup band. I got an audience. What more can I ask for? Uvla lorta. Asyang gata kata. Utkaya umukalo. Apaga kapkan. Akaga. Ikalyan. Apaluwa sigaban. Akaluwa tigawsin. Apaluwa sulik. Charles Stewart. Akaluwa asyang gata. Good morning. I'm Charles Brower, originally from Barrow. My mother and father are David and Marie. My grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side are Sigaman and Ikalan, Tigausen. My grandparents on my father's side, Charles DeWitt Brower, originally from Elizabeth, New Jersey, and my grandmother, Asengatak, whom I'm named after, was from Shishmarab, a few miles down the coast from Barrow. I introduce myself that way, and most of us do in Alaska. So we look for connections of who might know our families, who might know or have similar names. That way we feel better connected, an opportunity to have conversations about what's important to us. And I've seen a few faces this morning that I recognize from previous times in Nome or throughout Alaska. It's heartening to see those folks. Wonderful. But between 1869 and 1960s, as many as 100,000 Native American children were removed from their homes. They were removed from their families and their communities and taken away to schools. There we were punished for speaking our language, stripped of cultural practices and traditions. For those of you who might know a bit of the history of Alaska, back in the 1800s, Dr. Selden Jackson came to Alaska as a Presbyterian missionary. But he quickly became the face of the government for education for Alaska. And he went across, realized how large the state was at the time of territory of Alaska, decided that the Presbyterians couldn't possibly evangelize throughout that whole state. He left, came back here in 1948, and had a meeting with a number of other denominations. and they came up with a verbal comedy agreement. Which denomination will have which community within the state of Alaska? United Methodists were Johnny-come-ladies to that agreement. So when it came time to select their sphere of influence across Alaska, they selected those places where the Russian Orthodox had been for a long time. The only place where Methodism really grew in Alaska were those places where we had orphanages or hospitals. And that kind of leads to my story. I'm a product of boarding schools, a product of relocation programs. I was number 74 once upon a time. I was not known as Charles Brower, a Semita. I suppose the folks who ran that school, Wrangell Institute, where I was at, found it easier to call me and others by a number. Hey, 74, take care of your room. It was easier for them to call out numbers than to try to remember names at Ukpatsound, Aranasaga, Pasinguk, Niako. Somewhat difficult for some of those folks. And from the age of 10, I never heard the words, I love you, from caregivers or teachers. During my first month at Wrangell Institute, my mother died. I was not able to go and attend her memorial service. In the summers, I went to live with an older sister who at the time was married, who was and still is, but they're gone now. She was married to somebody in the Alaska Communications System, part of the United States Army. I never knew where I was going to spend my summers. I lived in Petersburg for a summer, Petersburg, Alaska, in southeast Alaska. I lived in Bethel, southwest Alaska. I lived in Delta Junction. And the last year I was in high school, I got to spend summer at my home, with my family. But during our times at boarding school, and this is one of the reasons that we have so many problems in the Native communities, that we did not have good role models to pattern ourselves after. No parents, no aunties or uncles, no elders to teach us the cultural ways or hunting skills we would need if we were to come back to our communities as productive members of that society. One of the few things I remember about my first trip to boarding school was that we were gathered in Fairbanks, those of us from the northern part of Alaska and from the interior. I met children from Wrangell, going to Wrangell with me, that were from interior Athabascans. Back in the day, it is told that we had battles with the interior folks, us coastal folks who were Inupiaq, the Eskimos. And it was known that the primary reason those battles happened, that one side or the other, the men wanted the women from the other side because they produced better looking children. But during that time, those of us who were Inupiaq and Eskimo or Yupik from different parts of Alaska met these folks, these young folks looking like us, wearing similar clothes. And they didn't seem to be too fearful. We didn't scare them, and they did not scare us. But I can remember that first trip. Bureau of Indian Affairs chartered an airplane, DC-6, to take us from Fairbanks to Juneau, where we were dispersed to a couple of different locations for school. When we got over Juneau, the plane circled because it was foggy in Juneau, we couldn't land. So we headed back, and the pilot landed at Whitehorse in Yukon Territory in Canada. They got us off the plane and they dispersed us, some to hotels, some to families with a home, with an extra bedroom. But they treated us to a movie in the afternoon, that evening at White Horse. My first experience, seeing a big screen TV, big screen movie, like this TV back here. But before we could see that movie, we had to stand for the singing of God Save the Queen. A little different from what we experience today. We don't go to a movie theater and sing Star Spangled Banner, do we? But that was the experience in White Horse. I have a lifelong friend from the little town of Minto. Minto has relocated to a different location, but the old Minto had a population of about 80 folks. This friend of mine, when the government agents came to take the children away to go to boarding school, her grandparents hid her. She remembers that was a winter of loneliness, no other children to play with, and her family always fearful that the agents would come back and take her away. What a different winter that was. Her name is Anna Frank. She's the Episcopal priest, retired now, but she used to assign Episcopal priests across Alaska for the Episcopal diocese there. Recently, she led a group of Wrangell Institute survivors back to the location of Wrangell. The buildings are no longer there, but the location, she took a group of survivors back to that place. They prayed, they had conversation, and started their journey into healing from their experiences. And yes, I experienced some abuses during my boarding school years, but I would rather remember the positive ones. For those of you who are aware of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, that divided up the state of Alaska to 12 different regions, that would not have been possible without the impact of boarding schools, having children from all over the state getting to know one another. When it came time for the passage of that bill, we were able to call friends from other parts of the state and say, let's gather together and make this thing work for us, for our favor. So one positive thing about boarding school, a big positive thing, is the impact of having friends in other parts of the state that you could call on and share strategies and game plans to make that thing work. And today we have the Alaska Federation of Natives that carries on that work. Unfortunately, a couple of regional corporations have left that over some minor ideologies that I think are a little something that trivial but important to those folks. Getting to know those kids from other parts of Alaska, other indigenous cultures, Yupik, Onongan or Aleut to most people, Dene, the name that the Athabascans give themselves, Kinaitsi, the Athabascan folks from the Kenai region, Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian, to name a few. The cross I wear today was given me by our bishop a number of years ago. On it is a totem pole that was carved by a former United Methodist pastor. It tells the Easter story in Tsimshian terms. I like this cross. But for those of us with not so wonderful experiences, the impacts today hurt our children, even down to our grandchildren, and some even to great-grandchildren. The lack of parenting roles is one major one that I like to point out. when your role models are teenagers a few years older than you are. They don't know how to parent, so we don't know how to parent. I'm fortunate. My wife is Irish. She grew up in a home that had family love. And she helped our children grow, our 4 sons. Wonderful. I'm proud of all of them. Many of our folks still don't know how to parent. When it comes time to go to parent-teacher conferences in school, they would rather not go because they don't want to remember the experiences they had and share those with the children or the teachers. No positive role models. It impacts us today. Yes, the parents are there when the children are playing sports. But something as important as parent-teacher conference, support your child. No. And that carries over to our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. I'm hoping someday that will change. One of the impacts on my life, being in boarding school away from fellows who would teach me how to hunt, how to read the weather, and be able to come back safely from wherever I was at, how to read the lands. I never learned those. So when it came time to go home, the lifestyle we led was by hunting. And that being able to read the signs, know where the animals are, I didn't know any of that. How is someone who wants to go hunting going to help me to go out with them? How will they help me? How will they choose me to be a hunting partner? I didn't have that option. It took me many years with another boarding school survivor cousin to understand the importance of how it is to train ourselves by talking to other folks to learn those cultural important things on something as simple as hunting to keep our families together. Those parents that were boarding school survivors, not many of them are willing to have conversations with their children or grandchildren because that memories still hurt. We don't want our children to know our feelings, our shame, and the things we had to experience. I'm 80 years old, one of the few remaining survivors of those boarding schools. But the ones addressing our situation, the issues that we faced, are our descendants. They do not have the first-hand experience to tell us stories. They know their family situations are not positive, and they don't know why. And some of us wonder if they are telling our stories historically correct, if they stress the horrors enough, if their expected results from their conversations with government or whomever, or churches, if they will correctly address the changes that are needed. We few remaining survivors, all we have left are our hopes, our stories, and not many places to tell them. I was a convener of a group of Alaska Native pastors sponsored by the Methodist Church a number of years ago. We called it Giving Voice. It started as a gathering of Native elders from across the state to discuss the impacts of departure of missionaries. I mentioned a little earlier about the comity agreement and how the state was divided up into spheres of influence by different denominations. the Russian Orthodox had it right as far as missionaries were going through. Those missionaries from the Russian Orthodox Church came from places like St. Petersburg and places like where near Moscow is today. Their church gave each one 2 pair of boots and told them to march east until they hit the coast and find a way to get to Alaska. Many of them took 2 and 3 years to make that trek. But along the way, they learned how to live in the communities, learn the language of those communities. So when they got to Alaska in the 1700s, they had schools operated in the local native language. Their church services were done in the local language. My first experience with missionaries was with the Presbyterian Church in Barrow. At the time, back in the 1950s, we had a once-a-year ship called the North Star that delivered supplies. And off the ship came boxes and barrels of stuff for one family. They needed a warehouse. They were supported by mission teams from across the country. They had no experience of having conversations in our local language. They did not eat our food. They did not live off the land like we did. Their impact was not very good. But our angatkos, our shaman across the state, they're kind of our spiritual leaders, our healers. And they told some fantastic stories. Travels to the moon, out-of-body experiences. So when the missionaries came telling stories about Jesus Christ healing people, demons going out, it was easy to relate to those unusual stories that the missionaries told. It was easy to become a convert to Christianity. My grandfather, Sigmund, was one of the first converts. I can still remember his stories. He used to live behind our house in Barrow in a tent for the summer. A couple of his grandchildren would come over, bring him coffee in the morning, sit at his feet, and he would tell us stories, those old stories of being converted, the old stories of the missionaries. That missionary family that came to Barrow lived in a 4-bedroom home, 2 stories. Most of the people in Barrow lived in 1-room house, 20 by 20. The whole family slept in 1 bed. And here we have a missionary with 3 children, 4 children, living in a 2-story mansion, a warehouse full of food. And how effective were they? I wonder about that sometimes. But the stories were told, that they told about Jesus Christ and His saving grace, stuck. But the impact they've had is even felt today. The elders that they taught about Christianity were also told that the dances we had, the songs we had, were anti-Christ. And it did not come just from one denomination. In King Island was selected by the Roman Catholic Church. The Jesuit priest who was there watched some of the dances. And one of the famous dances that they had, King Island, was the eagle and wolf dance. And that Jesuit priest said, this part, that part are not something I would approve. So they took all those away. There's nobody left in King Island who remembers what those parts were. They have an abbreviated version, not the eagle and wolf dance, just the wolf dance. And in Barrow today, the impact of those missionaries is so strong that the elders in the church will not allow drumming or any native things to happen in their church. And they wonder why it is so hard to get young folks to get interested in church. Young folks are taking time to learn about the history of our people, the dances, the stories. And if they're not told in church, or not even practiced in church, Where are they going to go? Not to that church. It's difficult. I was talking a little bit about giving voice, the gathering of native pastors. We met to share experiences, share the challenges we face, and eventually to involve our denomination leaders in conversations about how do we move forward with young folks. We had the support of the Alaska Superintendent Methodist Church, the Executive Presbyter for the Yukon Presbytery, the ELCA Bishop, and occasionally a representative from the Bishop from the Episcopal Church in Alaska. Giving voice included pastors from the Moravian, Presbyterian, Episcopal, American Friends, and United Methodist. I began my ministry in 2012 as a local pastor in the Nome Community United Methodist Church. But my years as a convener for Giving Voice gave me insight into the spiritual needs of rural Alaska. Even today, yes, today, there are still over 100 churches or communities across Alaska that may have a church building. But the missionaries have been gone for 75 to 100 years now. So there's Sunday morning worship. I ask them fairly regularly, what do you do for church on Sunday mornings? Televangelist, NFL football. That's it. No community. I'm looking forward to potluck later this morning. Community. How can televangelist and NFL football at your home with nobody else but your family make for a community of faith? Challenging. Some of the impacts of not having pastors in your church. Easter last year, I baptized 14 children, youth, and young adults at a church in Kaktovik. I recently baptized 8 adults and 2 children in the little town of Atkasuk. They want baptisms, they want the communion, but they have to wait for someone to come and offer the sacraments. We have too few pastors, young folks. I don't know how many of you know about the Presbyterian system, but the way the Presbyterian Church works, before you can be considered a commissioned lay pastor, you have to be selected as a session member, the leadership of the church. Most of the session members in the church in Barrow are 70 years old and above. To try to select or get somebody interested, a young man. I have 2 young men in that town, in that church, that want to become pastors. But there is no way they will be elected as session members. So what do? We have conversations with the executive presbyter. What changes can we make? I have a feeling those changes are not going to happen for another 20 years. In the meantime, what happens to those 2 young men who hope to become pastors? There's no way forward that they can see that they can have that support. The impacts of boarding schools not only goes on to family, it goes on into the church. And somehow, we need to find a way to make it more positive. Bishop Elaine Stanovsky ordained me as an elder in 2016. Even today, I am the only ordained member of the Alaska Conference. All the rest of our pastors are ordained elsewhere, came to Alaska as missionaries. They are not ordained members of our conference. We usually had two young folks ordained as elders in the Methodist Church, but they had to come to the conference center in Des Moines to be ordained as elders. They are not ordained in Alaska because we don't have that capability. Challenges. I don't know how we're going to make it happen. Part of our New Testament reading, our scripture this morning says, it is impossible for God to lie. We might have strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. For this iniquity, I find hope in God's word and the warm welcome I get from you folks. Thank you.